All right, so this is our virtual version of a South by Southwest panel on education for veterans in transition from military to civilian life. And I want to welcome our panelists and say thank you to all of you for taking the time to join us today. We will take a moment to introduce each of you and have you tell us a little bit about who you are and your background and experience on this topic. But I first want to say thank you, not just to you guys, but to South by Southwest for giving us a chance to do a virtual version of our panel because the 2020 event had to be canceled for a COVID crisis. And as disappointing as that was, I think we're also all grateful that they were willing to make that difficult decision and sort of fall on the sword, as it were, and accept the loss in exchange for probably many, many lives saved. So I want to take a moment to introduce all of you and introduce myself. My name is Julie Niehoff, and I am a co-founder of Skills After Service and Transition Skills Training, which are organizations that are veteran-focused and veteran family-focused for education, mostly focused on transition skills. So skills for finding a job, moving back into regular civilian life, and all the different soft skills, and also facilitating specific trade skills and learning for a lot of veterans. And I'd like for each of you to take a moment to introduce yourself. And could we start with Jay Niblick?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for putting this on. I think you guys organizing this was fantastic. It's needed. My name's Jay Niblick. I run a company called Wizehire. So we focus on hiring in general. So this was right up my alley as well. I was excited to see it.
Thank you, Jay. Scott MacLeod?
Yeah, thanks so much, Julie and CJ. Really love what you're doing. For me, the timing couldn't have just been more perfect. I was actually in transition when I met you guys and was able to come alongside you and just share some of the observations I had personally about my own experience. So after a 31-year career culminating as a brigade commander, and then with my last assignment actually downtown with Army Futures Command in downtown Austin, it was just really neat to be engaged with you guys at the same time. So thank you, appreciate what you're doing, and looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. Starr Corbin, can I say hi to you?
Yes, hi. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you again, Julie, and to the Skills After Service team for putting this together. I am the co-founder of Corbin Solutions Group. We're a boutique technology advisory firm. I started the company several years after I left service, after a 10-year military career. And I firsthand experiences the joys and the pain of transitioning from the military, which ultimately, culminated into a technology career that I've been able to maintain to this day. So it's a pleasure being here.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And I should take a minute to say, or to point out for any viewers, that all three of you are retired military, so you all have actual personal experience in the experiences that we're talking about in transition. So if you wouldn't mind, if we could just take a little time, just a minute each or a minute or two, and I'd like you to tell me your brief transition story. And I realize that it's a long story, but if you could truncate it and give me a sense of what you did initially and how you found your way generally after transition or during transition. Starr, you want to go first?
Sure. So I transitioned out of the service within months of returning home from Iraq. So I was pretty fresh home, about 90 days when I made my transition into the civilian world. I like to say that I was fortunate in the sense that my job role in the military was a technology officer. So I was able to pinpoint probably a little bit better than, for example, say my husband, who is an infantry officer, in terms of what I wanted to do in the civilian world. But the transition, the journey, meaning really the parts of actually finding a job and immediate employment, was much more difficult than I expected it to be. I think I averaged at about, it was about after 100 resumes, I only got one callback, and it was the job that I ended up taking. And one of the biggest qualifiers for me in that job was because I had a security clearance, which the role required. So, needless to say, one of the positive aspects of the transition that I took well advantage of was the education opportunities that were afforded to me. So shortly after I'd gotten out, the post 9/11 GI Bill benefits came out. And since leaving the military in 2005, I've exhausted my GI Bill benefits. And so my transition was made easier, more so due to the access to education that I was able to take advantage of.
Okay, great. And I know that you had a hand in forming the students organization at the University of Texas. Do you want to mention that really quick?
Yes. So shortly, about 6 months after I left the military, my husband, who I'd mentioned before was an infantry officer, he had also left the military a little bit before I did. He got called back into the Army from the inactive ready reserve while I was in graduate school. And during the course of experiencing that with him and getting him ramped up to go back into the military and experiencing the world as a military spouse on the home front for the first time, really started to see a lot of gaps in services, mental health services that were available to this wave of students who were leaving the military and joining and going into college. And so with two other veterans, we identified gaps that we felt that the university could help narrow with regards to mental health services and just peer group services. And from there, we spawned the Student Veterans Association in, I want to say 2006. And from that effort really snowballed into where UT really is a leader in student veteran services and actually built out a service center. They've got hired staff. So again, that initiative was, hey, we see, fellow veterans coming together. We saw a gap, and we were fortunate to have the support of the university to work with them to help them.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I appreciate it. I'm going to come back to you in just a minute. Jay Niblick, would you tell me a little bit about your transition from the military to civilian life?
It was a long time ago.
Think back. You can do it.
Exactly. So I transitioned out in January of 1992. And not unlike Starr, I was probably 4 months back from deployment in Kuwait and areas nearby. And I was enlisted. I was in the medical side as a corpsman, hospital corpsman. I don't remember much help and support. There was a pamphlet, didn't have PDFs back then. There was a pamphlet that I was handed. I don't remember any course as far as how to write resumes. So I got out, and being on the medical side, I had some hopes that I would be able to transition back right into a medical role in a civilian section. Didn't happen in that sector. They in 92 anyway, they weren't recognizing any of the training that I'd done in the military. So I actually had to go back to school to requalify as an EMT and then paramedic and start over. They gave me some credits, but that was it. So I was waiting tables at night and working as a landscaper, digging ditches during the daytime, and with a new baby living in my in-laws' house.
Oh.
So it was, not the smoothest of things. But I just remember it wasn't by malice or anything like that. There really just wasn't a ton of support. There were some resources and materials that were pointed out to us. They were pretty generic. And then making that transition back, there wasn't any real connectivity between what was in the civilian sector and what I had been doing in the military. So kind of had to take a lot of steps back and then start over again. And like the 70% that we see out there, today's statistics at first job, or in those cases, jobs didn't last the first year.
Yeah.
And I too got to take advantage of the GI Bill and eventually went back and finished college and went from there. But yeah, a rough couple of years in the beginning, but
and not exactly what you expected, but like you said, no malice. This isn't about, somebody's fault so much as a gap, like what Starr pointed out. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, which is why I think what you guys are doing is so important, and continuing 27 years later to drive the messages that companies need to learn these things, and all the things that everybody will talk about today. Still, unfortunately, relevant, I don't think as relevant by any means, but still lots of improvements to be made. And so that's why I really, really lit up when you guys told me what you were doing.
Thank you. So yours was in 92, is that what you said? A little ways back. Mm-hmm. And Starr, yours was in 2006, is that right? Is that what you said?
2005. Mm-hmm.
2005. Mm-hmm. And Scott, do you want to tell us about yours? I'd like to hear the difference because you just got out. So I'd like to know, is it different from what they've described for you?
It's a stark contrast, but in many ways it's still similar. So I retired after 31 years. It was a bit of a hard right turn for me. I'd actually been nominated for general officer and had been told to expect to be promoted to 1 star based on certain opportunities. And those opportunities didn't materialize for a number of reasons. And so my story very quickly turned, and I went from thinking that I'd go on from, a 31-year career to a 33 or 34-year career to suddenly facing retirement. And so I did have, about 7 months to kind of put my packet together and plan. But, as a senior officer, retiring as a 06 colonel, the real challenge for me was trying to figure out, did I want to go into another high up tempo, high stress, high reward type of a career field, or did I want to, spend some time with my family for the first time in a long time? And having deployed 3 times and been in very high up tempo operational assignments, the appeal of spending time with my family was really out there. So I was torn. Fortunately, I was able to fall back upon a strong social network here in Austin, and that was good. But even, I said there were still some similarities. Even with that strong social network, even with my, advanced experience in education, I still struggled. It's not easy for, a large organizational leader to jump from the Army and then find a C-suite role in the civilian market. So, there was a real wake-up call for me, and fortunately I had some good friends that helped. Ended up having 2 different opportunities. When I came out, I had 2 jobs. I laugh. I tell people I retired on a Saturday morning, and I went to work on Monday morning. That's a true story. But nevertheless, that was still through connections, and it was still through a lot of hard work and trying to reach out to folks. And if I could change things, I still would, which is why I'm interested in what you guys are doing.
Oh, I love it. We really appreciate all of you, by the way, helping out with our advisory council. It's really been amazing to have your input and your experience to help us do this. So let me point something out that I think is kind of interesting. All 3 of you coming out at different times and after different lengths of service. None of you told me about the class that they give you. You either didn't have a class or you don't remember the class. And again, this is not about blaming the military for not preparing people, but it's really about getting very clear on what people need and seeing if we can help make that happen. Is that a true statement that none of you remember the class or got much out of the class? The TAP class.
Oh, I'll be the first to say I don't
want to feel like you're trashing the military. That's not the point.
No. I'm actually one of the biggest advocates of joining the military. I remember, I think because I had gotten out, so, as soon as the stop losses ended for my unit, I was already transitioning out. And so part of my, me expediting my exit was I had a really good romantic notion of what the civilian world was going to be like. And so I couldn't wait to experience it. So I don't know what it's called today. It might be called the same thing, but usually it was called ACAP when I was transitioning from the military. And so it's just, these series of all these different steps and stops that you have to go through to make sure that, you're understanding the opportunities that are there. And I'm quite sure that there were some basic courses, but again, my experience was the courses were lumping everybody's skill set and opportunities into sort of one profile. And so sure, there was, I do remember that there was a resume shop, but it was more about formatting and, versus I really wanted scrutiny and understanding of what would appeal to a technology employer. And so, like Scott was saying, I relied on my network of friends. I had a friend who was in my unit whose wife was worked for Deloitte, and he said, give me your resume. And she doctored it up, and that's what I ended up using. So I just don't recall anything specific to, oh, you did this in the military. Here is what your experience translates into in terms of roles and opportunities in the civilian world. So it was, it would have been great to better understand so that I could better convey my talents in an interview and on the resume in terms of the kinds of work that I was qualified for. And in fact, I feel like I did such a poor job, in the transition because, like I said, out of almost 100 resumes, I got one callback, and it was for an entry-level job that required 2 years of experience. And so it really, I took what I could get because I had to get a job. And so I sold myself short. And didn't, I'm sure the opportunities were there, but getting out, I just wasn't necessarily, wasn't clear to me on how to best transition out of the military.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about the translation between military and civilian? And I think your resume story kind of hits it on the head, that when you're looking at your military resume and then you look at the job requirements of a civilian job, they don't always have the same language. It's literally a different language in many ways. And I've had several good talks with Jay Niblick about this. I'd really like you to weigh in on that, Jay, and the difference in the language and how you approach it, because I know you're addressing that at Wizehire as well.
Oh, you want me to go first? Yeah, sure.
Yes, sir.
And as you listen, you hear a military machine, as great as they are, that are much better equipped at onboarding and training than necessarily offboarding or exiting. And again, that's not their primary purpose, so I don't fault anything there. I think the problem comes where you have a gap with organizations, corporations, and enterprises who are much better at onboarding civilians. They don't understand. I mean, sniper to a hiring manager doesn't mean anything.
Let's hope not.
And they're not going to get excited about it. But for that gentleman that has that on his background, he has to understand how to put down, used to working in a VUCA situation, very uncertain, very ambiguous, high pressure, team building with somebody that's got a greater cause and purpose to be loyal to than maybe just a paycheck or something. Those things, if you could figure out how to translate that. And I think that's where the gap that I've seen still exists today is how does this organization really understand that organization and the people that are transitioning are caught in between. And I don't know that either party is ideally suited for it unless you take a group of people that have gone through it, because you've got military people thinking this is what we'll send you out with. And do they really truly understand what the corporations are looking for? And if you've got a bunch of civilian corporate leaders that haven't served, do they understand? So it's lost in translation, if you will, to use the cliche, but that's where we've seen, in my experience, the biggest problem. And even with what Starr talked about, lots of rote sort of, here's how to write a good resume, and Here's how to apply to jobs, and here's places you can go to put your job on Indeed and ZipRecruiter and things, you know. But where's the substance underneath it of how do I put down exactly what I've done and translate that to what they're used to hearing, and is going to be exciting them, not, you know, for you guys, something that you'd see on a TAPS review or something like that, you know.
Sure. So it's almost like middleware. We need that middle piece, you know, between the civilian and military, and not just practical language changes, which is what we've been talking about, but also philosophical changes in approach and language and understanding. And Scott, you said something in your transition story that sort of caught my attention because you were talking about your network, the people that you depended on, and Starr mentioned that as well. And can you talk about the importance of starting there? Because it sounds like you sort of were able to bypass some of the practicality and go straight for the human transition of finding where you fit.
Yeah, so I was like Starr's husband. I was an infantry officer. I was a career infantry officer. And so, you know, I spent my entire career in infantry assignments, you know, and it doesn't translate real well unless you need somebody to seize a small village or, you know, blow something up. And so, fortunately, you know, as you progress, you get the opportunity to lead large organizations. So, you know, having commanded a battalion or a brigade. So I was confident in those abilities, but one of the best pieces of advice that was given to me, I was at a social about 7 years ago here in Austin. And a friend of mine, also a former officer, said to me, he said, you know, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when you retire or get out. He said, you need to start dipping your toes into the networks that are outside the Army. And, you know, for whatever reason, I took that seriously, and I began to make myself available to invitations to attend different events. And, you know, it was through a series of events that I met a handful of people, which would eventually end up being pivotal in my last assignment down at Futures Command, because I was able to reach back into those connections and actually leverage them my last year in. And so they not only helped me my last year in the Army, but they also helped in my transition. I found that about 1 out of every 25 engagements I had actually turned into what I would call a real relationship. CJ was one of those. You know, CJ was one of 25 that turned into an honest to goodness friendship and a relationship. So again, taking that guy's advice was very smart. I was fortunate. I was able to do it. I think about all of my peers who don't get that opportunity, or maybe weren't in an assignment like Futures Command, where I was exposed to, you know, centers of influence throughout downtown Austin. And I feel for them because it was pivotal for my successful transition.
So a lot of studies and information that I've been reviewing and talking with you guys about have shown that many veterans, when they are leaving the military, are just then beginning the process, meaning the moment that they retire from the military is the moment they start to think, what am I going to do? And, you know, and I'm not saying because they put it off, it's just not top of mind until it's top of mind. Is that true in your experience? Do you think that that's a fair statement? And how far back do you think they need to start? Because you said you started, well, now you're telling me 7 years. That's a long time.
Yeah, so first of all, I do think it's true. In fact, there's an old saying, a buddy of mine, these jobs are the ones that make you stupid. And what he meant by that, you know, when you're a battalion commander or you're a staff officer at a brigade or a division level, or you're a brigade commander, you're working 50+ hour weeks. You're ignoring things like personal development. You're ignoring networking. You're ignoring thinking about abstract ideas like, you know, a 5-year plan. You're not thinking about that at all. You're trying to keep your head above water. You're trying to survive, and you're trying to get a top block evaluation so you can get promoted or move on to your next assignment. And so in those high up tempo, high stress assignments, it's incredibly difficult for, you know, service members to slow down and focus on themselves. It's one of the worst things we do. We ignore our own health. We sacrifice our families. Because, you know, if you survive that long, you've been taught that it's a gut check. half of what you're doing is just trying to keep your head above water and keep moving forward. So yeah, I think it's terrible. And fortunately, again, I just had a good friend who said the right thing to me, and I took him seriously. He was a successful tech entrepreneur here in Austin, former officer. And, I felt like he knew what he was talking about because he had spent some time in the civilian world and had done very well. And I listened to him.
So I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but it turns out most civilians in America believe that the number one problem that veterans are dealing with is PTSD. Is that something that you believe or agree with? Apparently, only 10% of veterans who leave the military are officially dealing with PTSD, have been diagnosed and are managing that. Have you heard that stat before?
I haven't heard that stat, but it doesn't surprise me that that's the common stereotype. I think that veterans do have.
I'd like to bust that myth up if we could, because it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a real issue. There is a real problem with veterans having PTSD, right? I don't think that there's any disagreement in that, but I do think that that is an existing stigma for all veterans, and even for veterans with PTSD, that those veterans are completely incapable of leading successful civilian lives. And I can't help but think that it is part of, the difficulty as to why veterans are having a hard time finding jobs. Not so much because the PTSD is preventing them from finding jobs, it's because of the stigma that employers might have. I do think that it's probably more difficult, and I can only speak this from a military spouse, again, with my husband being a former infantry officer, and the stigmas that he faced in terms of the kind of work that he was sort of stereotyped to only be qualified for. And so I think, his transition into the civilian world was similar, but also very, very different from my own. And so I do worry that is just one more roadblock that a veteran does have to go through in terms of facing or dealing with that stereotype when it does come to transitioning into the civilian world.
Anyone else want to weigh in on PTSD as the perception as it stands?
Yeah, I think that Starr said it well. It's not as widespread, I think, as people believe. I think, my concern is more for substance abuse and, even suicide in the military. We have horrendous suicide rates, which we haven't been able to get our arms around. So, but I don't think PTSD is as widespread. And I guess it's just due to Hollywood and media coverage that people think that it's much more rampant than it is.
I agree with that. Jay, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, no, I would totally appreciate and respect and agree with everything they've said. I think part of it is lack of familiarity. Whenever you get two groups that don't really know each other very well, there's always that perception problem. And like, Scott said, Hollywood and what gets the biggest spotlights put on it and stuff like that. And whether you're Shia and Sunni or Palestine and Israel, if you don't ever hang out with each other, you just have these perceptions. And so Starr said it really well, I think, too. So these people coming out, I can't employ them because they've got PTSD, and they don't really know. There's 200,000, I think, roughly, transitioning veterans every year. There's 350 million, other U.S. population. I mean, it's a small percentage, and so many people I know in companies really don't know a whole lot of veterans, or they know them in the organization 10 years after they've been out and acclimated. I think there's all kinds of myths and things that need to be corrected as to what they can do and what they're best at and what's the real issue. The Institute of Veterans and Military Families in Syracuse said 55% of veterans are worried about instability in their job transition. That's a big number. 10% is horrible. And you're right on the suicides and the PTSD, both of you. But more than the majority are much more worried about that. And last thought, I think part of the problem is just kind of due to most people in the military I knew, their ethos, they don't walk around telling you about it. So you don't hear it. It's not getting played up, the fear and the angst and the struggle and the difficulty they're having with where do I go? What's my job going to be? How do I get it? They just get her done, which is one of the benefits we usually tell employers is why you want to hire a veteran.
Yeah. It's actually noble in many ways. And also with what, Scott, what you were saying about not taking care of yourself or your family and really focusing on the mission at hand, there's a noble backdrop to that there's, greater with the many. And to focus on yourself feels selfish and disloyal in a way. And that's actually a big piece of what we're trying to address is the making it okay to focus on yourself, to make yourself the mission, to think a little bit about what you want or where you want to go and how you could take the skills that you got in service and apply them to civilian life.
When I wrote my resume, it was the first resume I had ever written in my entire life. It's no exaggeration. And so I would send it to these executives and I would tell them, and many of them, again, were connections or friends. And I'd say, I've never written one before. I'm and so, again, you don't think about that. And then suddenly, like Jay was describing, I'm trying to describe what my experience is leading, thousands of soldiers, how that compares to a business that's focused on a profit and loss statement or marketing and sales goals, et cetera. And, I thought, man, I had incredible experience, but even I got 2 master's degrees. I'm a graduate of the War College, and I struggled to write my resume in a way that I thought would be appealing to senior leaders of the major, businesses here in Austin. And so if I'm having that struggle, then I know the vast majority of everybody else is having the same struggle.
I think
Scott brings up a really good point. It's also not just writing the resume, but to Scott's point, it's also writing a resume for the kind of role that you feel you are qualified for in the civilian world. And that's where in my transition, that's where the programs that I went through fell short. It wasn't so much, hey, Starr, let's focus on writing a resume for the kind of role that based off of your experience, et cetera, and the industry you want to go into that you are qualified for. And I will say, though, that on the positive, you fast forward to now, there is an overwhelming amount of more programs, I think, for soldiers transitioning in terms of, I think, civilian companies are now just coming on board. But I do think that probably for, it's a little bit easier, again, if you're going into tech, so I guess a good example of the kind of a successful transition that I've seen firsthand so far, because his transition's not complete yet, but was one of my soldiers when I was in the military. He's retiring now, which is wild for me to say that, but he came to me as an E2, but he's retiring now, and he was in my signal unit, and his actual leave date isn't until, I want to say, the late summer. But I saw him join LinkedIn, for example, several months ago, and he started friending all of us that he knew went into the civilian world that stayed in tech. And at one point he reaches out to me and he was like, Starr, this is what I think I want to do. Everything I've read about in terms of tech roles, this is what I feel like I'm good at. Can I get 30 minutes and get your perspective on, like, what are the roles that you feel that I'm qualified for? What is the language? What are the certifications? What kind of training? He's like, because all I think is, he's like, well, I got my bachelor's degree while I was in the military. He's like, but I'm like, do I have to get an MBA? And so we were able to talk through to where it was like, listen, if, there are shorter programs, certain technical certifications that based off of your interest that you can get. But if you want to start a business or run a business, et cetera, absolutely go out and get your MBA. But for what you're looking for and what I know of the industry, here are the roles that I think you'd be fantastic at. And here are some of the well-known certifications in terms of that are, could take you a week or whatnot that you can get that I know that your GI Bill will pay for. And so the next thing I know, he's heading to Southwest Airlines for an internship, right, to do product ownership type of work. So it was just really interesting, but he specifically, not just from a conversation with me, but a conversation with others that he pinpointed that had, in his mind, had successfully transitioned. He was able to go through we even walked through his interview. And he said, okay, here's what the internship is. And here's, I have this interview on this date. And so we literally walked through it. He's like, what would you be looking for? How do you hire? And to be able to not just talk about transitioning in terms of theory and a high level, but to actually give him actionable talking points that he could use immediately in a specific role that he was looking for. It was a value to me because I was telling him sort of my story of what not to do when you transition. And he was able, and he called me a week later. He says, I got the internship. It was fantastic. So, I think relying on, taking advantage of these amazing programs that a lot of these large companies have now available for transitioning military service members, but then utilizing networking platforms such as LinkedIn, just one example, to reach out to people that that may have had a successful transition and get their point of view as well, so that, again, you can tighten up your story and better pinpoint what it is that you're seeking afterwards.
Sure. I love that.
It's an interesting side thought real quick. I mean, you're familiar with SCORE, even the Service Corps of Retired Executives. It'd be wonderful if the military in general could put together some sort of sponsorship program.
Yes.
It's much more structured, much more intentful. You're talking about a self-guided sponsor program where I go out to my social media. Both of you just told very compelling stories about how it made the difference in two people's lives, your own, Scott, and your friend, Starr. But is there anything structured like that? Is there a system that doesn't just give the logistical information that the military is providing and the resources? But wouldn't it be marvelous if there was a core of veterans who have transitioned into civilian life, whatever the qualifications may be, who are there? Don't have to be in my network per se. I can go in and connect. We see that in companies. One of the recommendations and tips that we talk about with organizations is to have veterans on the hiring panel and a sponsor inside the organization, because you're transitioning not just to the corporate culture, but the civilian culture at the same time. And it's just infinitely more difficult to do. But maybe that's something that someday we could help influence, is an actual program where the military are connecting people with outside sponsors to get that granular level of understanding, because it's so siloed in the military. I'm not going to change MOSs very easily anyway, or Scott spent 31 years as an infantry officer, but everything's so flat in the civilian world now. You can go into technology, but there's a million different industries in which technology plays. So it's not an easy progression of, they could go into education, they could go into healthcare, they could go into IT, anything like that. It's just a wild west, but I think a sponsor would really help with, like you did. That's a great example.
Love that. I love that you brought up SCORE. They actually do have a national program for veterans called Boots to Business. Have you guys heard of that with SCORE? It hasn't been updated a whole lot lately, but there are a lot of good people running Boots to Business programs all over the country as part of SCORE. And SCORE works in a mentoring fashion. The people that are helping are mentors, they are counselors. So, but I don't think that they require that it be a veteran that is counseling in the Boots to Business. So that might be something interesting to talk to them about. I think we need to make sure that we've said in this discussion that while the misconception about PTSD is that it's more widespread and and in reality it's only 10%. 3/4 of all veterans who leave the military report transition stress, which is a new term for something we haven't always called the same thing, but that is the now catch-all phrase. Is transition stress is the number one problem. And it is everything we've been talking about, the language problem, the differences between practical versus philosophical, and exactly what do you do when you leave the military to ensure success. And it sounds like you guys at least have some consensus that your connections and your personal sphere of influence is a big piece of that, is finding mentors and counselors and people that can help guide you. Is that true? You think that?
Yeah, and Jay said something about the difference in understanding, and part of that is explainable. You realize that the senior leaders of the military aren't actually experienced in the civilian world. Now, that's not, I don't mean that to sound overly critical. All I mean it to say is the generals I worked for weren't successful civilian leaders because they were generals in the Army, right? So the people that are my mentors, as I get ready to transition, and if you're transitioning, when Starr was transitioning, her battalion commander wasn't a former civilian business leader. So our leaders that exist in the military aren't necessarily the best ones for informing and educating their transitioning soldiers, sailors, Marines. So we really do have to have mentors on the outside that are kind of willing to pick us up and help in that area.
Well, all of us have been studying this experience and granulating down to the data, and also sharing these human stories of what is it like and what is needed and what would make it better. And I know that at Skills After Service and in our conversations just as a group, we've talked about the need for a sense of purpose or direction, or either finding a job or starting a business, or even just thinking about what is it that I want to do. Taking that time to sort of focus on your own future. And then we've also talked about the need for connection. You need a sense of connection in your life in order to cross this gap that we know is coming for every single person who's leaving the military. And then we also need a place to call home, whether that's staying with your family while you're figuring out, or leasing a place, or buying a place. You have to decide. And I learned recently that the very first thing you have to tell the military when you're leaving is where you're headed, because they need to be able to tell you where to get your benefits and where to get your health care and all of that. So where you're hanging your hat and how you spend your time and your energy in terms of your future, and the people that you surround yourself with turn out to be key. Those are the three big pieces. Can you guys talk to me a little bit about how those three things fit into your way of looking at it? I mean, you've all talked about connection, and you've all talked about finding that purpose or that way of getting there, and you've all talked about the way that you experienced it and the way that you've seen others experience it. But can you talk to me about those three things and whether you think, is there something missing from that equation, or is there something else that we haven't thought about?
I think going back to your point about the transition stress, I think that is probably one of those it's not discussed as much in terms of what does that really mean. And it's not just, I'm leaving the military for this unknown civilian world, but a lot of times soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, we're leaving the military, and we've got families, we've got liabilities, we've got assets, we've got this, this whole, for the most part, this whole unit of our lives to take care of. And yet I remember going and looking for a job, and I didn't know about negotiating a salary. I didn't know about really looking at the cost of healthcare. That to me was the biggest sticker shock, was that I did not factor in when it came to really looking for a job, was the full scope of benefits. I saw just a dollar amount in terms of a salary, and then all of a sudden going from, and I was a military brat, so I'd grown up in, being incepted in the TRICARE program from birth and then entering into the military while I was in school. And so I had never had to even think about healthcare costs. Housing, costs was also something very different. And so that was also a gap, was specific skills to the skill to really scrutinize a job position to ensure that it offered a suite of benefits similar to the military or some form of healthcare, but understanding even what those costs were, the difference between, the healthcare market and PPA and HMO. I mean, all of these different things that I didn't even think about to ask in an initial job interview. It was, I needed a job so bad. And I was willing to just take, at that point, the first thing that I needed. Now, I was lucky that my first job out of the military was at the University of Texas. So I went to work for the state and it was the perfect job for me after the military, but more so because of all of the benefits that I received. So I do think that when we think about transition stress, it's not just trying to find and assume a new identity. It's also looking at it from the entire scope of, I have to also find a job that is going to take care of my family in the same capacity that the military took care of me and my family. And that's the stressful piece. And so I remember even talking, with my former soldier, I said, have you thought about healthcare? Have you done any homework on healthcare? And he was like, I just know it's really expensive. And I said, when you're ready to talk, you give me a call, because I can talk my head off about what to look for in terms of healthcare benefits and plans. And I was like, 401k, have you thought about so those types of things that, I sort of like to call it the financial literacy piece of transition, that I think is a gap too. Another thing though, that I've been out since 2005 from active duty, I still rely, and now as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, I still heavily rely on my veteran peer group who are entrepreneurs and who have started successful businesses. And so I remember, and what I love about talking to my fellow veteran entrepreneurs is we're not having MBA talk. We're not talking about theory and corporate restructuring. And I remember sitting down with my buddy James, who is a successful entrepreneur, and sort of going over my business plan and what to look at here and there. And he said, Starr, he says, you just got to find your mission. You got to find your mission, and then you got to work like hell to be the best at it. That's it. And that to me has been some of the best business advice that I've received thus far, but it was from a peer group, and it was from a veteran who we just understood how to communicate in that way.
I love that. And I love the financial literacy piece. That's really an important part that we assume we all know, but we don't. Jay, we've been adding, or busy on the Skills After Service side, adding the DISC assessment that you at Wizehire are using. Can you talk a little bit about that and the benefit of having a chance to really look at your own personality in terms of where you go next?
Yeah, I'm glad to. One piece I want to add to Starr's comment, and well put, real quick, a transition is really the ending of something and the beginning of something else. If it's smooth, that's nice, but there's still finite end to this and beginning to that. We've talked a lot about the acceptance piece. One piece that adds to that stress that I don't think we've touched on yet is the separation. They don't use that word so much. It's transitioning, which sounds a lot gentler and nicer than separation. But when you're leaving a team, you're leaving peers, you're leaving a very close-knit group of people, the ones that Starr's talking about with veterans who are entrepreneurs, those types of relationships and the purpose for being there and the reason, that's a lot of stress. I'm leaving my purpose in life. I'm leaving what I was dedicating my body to and my mind. And so you're separating from that. So it's always very, very scary, I think, for anybody, no matter where they are, how long they've been around. When you talk about personality assessments, a good friend of mine is actually transitioning out of the Air Force right now. and 05, deployed 10 times as a medevac helo pilot. All kinds of wonderful accolades and awards, and a hell of a hero. No idea what would happen in an interview. It was a panel. I mean, we've talked plenty of times about what's it mean that there's this panel of people that are going to be talking to. What's that like? I think it's scary that, like Scott talked about, never put a resume together in his life. And same thing here. 24 years with this gentleman I'm thinking about, and never had to do a job interview for anything. So any kind of assessment, one of the things we're trying to do is bring some scientifically accurate or valid tools to help with that translation, so the veterans can take these assessments. Again, they have to be valid, they have to be rigorously tested, but any good, valid, and reliable psychometric or personality assessment or behavioral assessment or whatever you want to call it helps read into what those civilian terms are, because the way they're written aren't in a military setting, which is kind of funny because the beginning of that industry was really around World War II when it took off as far as personality testing and skills testing. But it gives them words in this assessment, if you will, that says, here's the things you're really strong at, here's the things you're weak at. But those words are written in a corporate context. They're written for hiring managers or corporate leaders or managers. They're not written from a military standpoint. So I think anybody using anything they can find like that that's online, doesn't matter whose it is, make sure it's valid, make sure it's accurate. And we can leave some resources behind to help you understand how to best do that. Volume of use is not necessarily one of them, but if it's a good profile, that is a great way for some assessment that's been studied by many different industrial organizational psychologists over many, many years. Some of them 80 or 90 years is the original theory, like Marston from Harvard in 1926. One of the most common models out there, that DISC, D-I-S-C, gives them tools where they literally can look in a profile. And I was thinking of my friend who just took one of those several weeks ago and was reading through that and making notes of, in preparing for the interview, being able to take snippets from that to say, well, one of the things I'm strong at, but in the homework prior to that, connecting it to real examples from his career. But it started with a civilian description that he then back channeled to what I see that as in my civilian life.
Did you help him translate it for himself, or was he able to just look at the output and say, this is how I'm going to do it?
I worked with him. I worked with him, and I think what the others here on the call have said as well is, I don't think any one item will work by itself as a standalone.
Sure.
Having that mentor, sponsor, whatever you want to call it, to say, here's how that would interpret in my experience, I think is crucial.
Okay. Scott, would you, I have two questions for you, and then we have to wrap up because we're running out of time, but I want to ask you have two jobs. You are a headmaster at a private school that has integrated learning, which I want to hear more about, especially how you're managing that during COVID and how that's working out. But I also want to ask you about the AR company that you're working for and how you are changing the way people learn practical things, like what's happening inside of an ambulance, I believe is one example you told me. And tell me where that's going and where you think that's going to lead for first responders and people in all kinds of careers in terms of learning and education.
Sure. So happened to step into a small nonprofit role as the headmaster of a small private school. Two of my kids attend there, and my wife works there as the part-time nurse. So there was a bit of affinity for the school. But it was a natural choice for me. I cared about the institution, but secondly, it's a small battalion, basically.
Very small, little.
Well, when you count up my kids, a couple hundred kids, 400 or so parents, 50 faculty and their spouses, it's about a battalion. So, I'm able to apply the organizational leadership experience that I gained in the military to help them. And that makes me feel good because, again, that was one of my big choices. Do I go high up tempo, high reward, high stress, or do I try to give back and have more time with my family? So that's been really fun. It's great to be around the kids. They all call me the Colonel, which is kind of neat. But anyway, but it's natural. Education is very similar to training. And so it's its own profession, but nevertheless, there's a lot of similarities. In my tech startup role, so my third startup company that I've been a member of, I wasn't the founder. We're a small augmented and virtual reality training company, and we're redefining the way learning is going on. And right now, at least until a vaccine is created for COVID-19, learning will never happen the same way again. The old model of stuffing human beings into a room, sitting next to each other with a PowerPoint presentation, that's just not relevant anymore. It's not going to work that way. And so, it's real fun. It's a new technology. Obviously, with my experience in the military, I saw the value, higher cognitive recall levels, increased time on task, huge savings in logistics, no longer having to funnel people into centralized locations for training. So that's been really neat, and it's fun. And, again, it's my third one. 85% of startup companies fail. And so you got to be willing to risk it. So I thought I would share a story, though, real quick, if I could. I was interviewing with an executive of a very well-known tech company here in Austin that'll remain nameless. And the guy looks at me after about an hour of having coffee, just a great conversation, just very natural. And he says to me, he says, Scott, he said, if I had your experience and your education, I would not be applying for this job. I'd be doing other things, because I was interested in a very high stress, global type of responsibility, flying around the world all the time. And that just really struck me. That was some great insight to hear that executive tell me that he wished he was me. Because what he said was, with all that you have, you've got some incredible opportunities. But, again, I had to meet him, I had to hear that, et cetera. It would have been wonderful to have heard that a year before as part of an effective transition from the military. And so, anyway, I attended all of my transition classes. The ladies at Fort Hood told me, sir, generally the colonels don't go to these. And I said, no, I'm going to go in there. I started in the Army as a private, and I'm not too good. I'll sit next to those E4s and E5s, and I want to hear the briefing. So I sat through every single one of them. I attended every single one of them. And I thought they were very valuable, but they cannot substitute for references and connections. And so that's one of the biggest challenges. And I just think what Jay said about CORE and maybe a military equivalent version of that is profound. Guys like me and others, Starr and Jay and others who are willing to come alongside and act as mentors, I think that's what we need to be willing to do.
I love that idea. I like that as a general place to stop. I'm going to ask each one last question. I'd like to know where you found a connection for yourself to just be. Like, I know, for example, that behind Starr we can see some art, and I'm guessing that is Drew's art. Is that true?
It is. Yes, it's all Drew's art. Yes.
Amazing. Amazing. And so obviously your husband has found painting as something that's sort of his outlet. What have you found, and do you recommend that veterans find something that means something to just them, music or art or in any volunteering? It doesn't have to be creative, but tell me about that for you.
I do. It's almost like a hobby side hustle. I remember when I was leaving the military, I acknowledged that finding a next chapter that was as fulfilling as that first chapter would be something that I would struggle with for a good long time. And so for me, the outlet that I had was through volunteering, through trying to, I grew up in the military. Like I said before, my father was career military, and I went into the military, enlisted first, and then got my commission. And I went in thinking that I was going to be a lifer, as Scott, for example. And I had an amazing, fantastic experience in the military. And so I really said I have to try to be a part of not just one thing, but several different things throughout the next stages of my life where there is some type of meaning or giving back. And so for me, that has either been through philanthropy with existing veterans organizations or in our local community. And part of that is some of the commission work that I do. And, but it started off with the Student Veterans Association and trying to really get well-versed on the resources that are available to veterans, not just for myself, but so that I could share those resources with others. So for me, it has been, trying to continue service in whatever capacity that I'm able to.
Love that. Thank you. Jay, you want to go next?
Sure. I was lucky in that I think I was able to continue the same thread, really the same altruism that was driving me in my roles that I had. I was robbed. I wasn't planning on getting out. I lost a fair amount of vision in my left eye, and so I got a down shit and couldn't do any of the fun stuff that I trained so hard to do. So I exited out and I moved into medical and emergency medicine and first responding, and then eventually, by the time you have 3 boys, you realize they eat a lot and wanted to try to get a little bit more revenue coming in. So after going to college on the GI Bill, I moved into Johnson & Johnson in surgical consulting. So hang out at Mayo Clinic, and that was feeding off of the same, so far that's 2 different careers coming out that fed off of the same drive to try to help people just in different ways. And even the founding of the 2 companies, the same ethos again is still there behind it. How are we doing something that's making a life better for people? Our value statements here are happier, healthier people, and it's one of the values that we have. So I think the best advice I think I would give is, regardless of what the technical challenges are in front of you as you're transitioning out, and what the specifics of the role are going to be, is there an underlying cause and motivation for you that you enjoyed when you were in the military, and can you find something that's just still the exact same? If it's technology and you love new technology, then get out and find a new technology. Is it people? Is it organizations? It's whatever it is that was motivating you in this military sector. I think it helps a lot in transitioning to try to find something that still allows you to achieve that same drive, just in a different way and in a different platform.
Love that. Thank you. Scott?
Well, I don't have a great deal of free time since I run 2 organizations, but I actually, I do free consulting. So my real strong suite is operational design, how to scale an organization and do things. So I try to give back, and I've helped a couple of organizations here in Austin just by volunteering to come in and kind of help them frame up and understand their operating environment and how to look at a long-term, 5-year plan based on setting conditions. And so it makes me feel good. And again, it was one of those, as Jay said, what do you care about? Those things that make you tick. And I knew coming out, I really wanted to be able to give back in some way. And so the opportunity to go in and volunteer and help different organizations really helps me. And then I teach. I'm very involved in our local church, and I teach. And so it makes me feel good to kind of give back in that way as well.
That's a perfect place to end, because it gives me a chance to say thank you to all 3 of you for giving your time and your energy, not just on this call, but helping us with skills after service and transition skills training and trying to build solutions that will actually help people. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I need to say also thank you to South by Southwest and to Zoom for making this possible.